Jake Morrison pressed his face against the small window of the transport ship and watched the massive space station grow larger. Kepler-7 looked like a giant metal flower floating in the darkness, with long arms reaching out in all directions. Lights blinked along its surface like tiny stars. He had dreamed of this moment for months, but now that it was actually happening, his stomach felt tight with nerves. The transport ship docked with a soft bump. Jake grabbed his single bag and followed the other passengers through the airlock. The station smelled clean and metallic, with a hint of something he could not identify. The gravity felt exactly like Earth, which was a relief. He had worried about floating around like in the old space movies. A tall blue creature with 4 arms waited near the entrance. It held a digital pad and spoke in perfect English. "Welcome to Kepler-7 Academy. Please state your name and home. World for registration." "Jake Morrison from Earth," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The creature's large black eyes widened slightly. "Ah, yes, our first human exchange student. I am Administrator Quinn. Welcome to our academy. You will find your room assignment and schedule on this pad." It handed him a thin device with one of its 4 hands. Jake thanked the administrator and looked around the main hub. The ceiling stretched high above, and he could see creatures of all shapes and sizes walking around. Some looked almost human, but with different colored skin. Others were completely alien, like the group of floating, jellyfish-like beings that drifted past him making musical sounds. He found his room on level 7. The door slid open with a soft hiss when he pressed his hand to the scanner. Inside, he found a simple but comfortable space with 2 beds, 2 desks, and a large window showing the stars outside. One bed was already occupied by what looked like a small mountain of purple crystal. "You must be my roommate," the crystal said, and Jake nearly dropped his bag. The voice came from somewhere inside the crystal formation, warm and friendly. "I am Zeph from Nexus Prime. You are the human, correct?" "Yes, I'm Jake. Nice to meet you." Jake set his bag on the empty bed and tried not to stare. The crystal was beautiful, with light moving through it in slow patterns. "I have heard much about humans," Zeph said. "Your species has quite a reputation among the galactic community." Jake felt his cheeks get warm. He knew what reputation Zeph was talking about. Humans came from what other species called a death world. Earth was considered one of the most dangerous planets in known space. Most alien worlds were peaceful places where the biggest predator was something like a space rabbit. Earth had bears, sharks, poisonous snakes, and 1,000 other things that could kill you. "We're not that bad," Jake said quickly. "Most humans are pretty peaceful." "Oh, I did not mean to offend," Zeph said, his crystal form flickering with what might have been embarrassment. "It is just that your world is so intense. I read that you have creatures called tigers that hunt for sport and plants that can kill you if you touch them." "Well, yes, but we've learned to live with all that stuff. It's not like we're constantly fighting for our lives or anything." Zeph's light patterns shifted. "Perhaps we should discuss something else. Have you seen your class schedule yet?" Jake looked at the pad Administrator Quinn had given him. The classes had names like Galactic History, Interspecies Communication, and Mathematics of Space Travel. One class caught his attention: Conflict Resolution and Personal Safety. "What's this safety class about?" he asked. "Oh, that is a required course for all students," Zeph explained. "Professor Valen teaches us how to avoid dangerous situations and resolve conflicts peacefully. It is very important here at the Academy. We have a strict policy against any form of violence." "Violence?" Jake was confused. "It's just a safety class, right?" "Yes, but you must understand, Jake. Most species in the galaxy have never experienced real violence. Our worlds are peaceful. We solve problems with words, not force. The Academy has never had a single fight in its 300-year history." Jake nodded, but he felt a little worried. On Earth, everyone learned basic safety from a young age. His mom had taught him simple self-defense when he was 12, just like every other kid. It was as normal as learning to ride a bike or swim. But here it sounded like even the idea of physical conflict was scary to these aliens. The next morning, Jake joined hundreds of other students in the main auditorium for orientation. He had never seen so many different species in one place. There were tall, thin creatures that looked like walking trees, small, fuzzy beings that reminded him of animated teddy bears. A group of blue-skinned humanoids with silver hair sat near the front. Professor Valen took the stage. She was tall and graceful, with pale skin that seemed to glow softly. Her voice carried easily through the large room without any microphone. Welcome, students, to another year at Kepler-7 Academy. Here, we celebrate the diversity of intelligent life in our galaxy. We learn from each other and grow together in peace and understanding. Jake looked around at the other students. They all seemed excited and happy. A small green amphibious creature sitting next to him smiled and waved with a webbed hand. I'm Kes from Aquatica, the creature whispered. This is my second year. You will love it here. Thanks, Jake whispered back. I'm Jake from Earth. Kes's large eyes grew even larger. Earth? The Death World? How exciting. I have read about your planet. Is it true that your oceans have creatures with hundreds of teeth? Sharks? Yeah, they exist, but they mostly stay away from people. Kes shivered, which made his wet skin shimmer. Fascinating and terrifying. Professor Valen continued her speech, explaining the Academy's rules and values. She talked about respect, learning, and peace. She mentioned the zero-tolerance policy for violence 3 times. Each time she said it, Jake noticed some of the other students glancing at him. After the orientation, Jake walked back to his room with Zeph and their new friends, Kes and Lyra. Lyra was a bird-like creature with beautiful golden feathers and bright, intelligent eyes. She came from a world called Area, where her people lived in floating cities among the clouds. So, Jake, Lyra said as they walked through the corridors, what was your world really like? I have heard such strange stories about Earth. It's actually pretty nice, Jake said. Sure, there are some dangerous animals and weather, but most places are safe if you're smart about it. We have beautiful forests, mountains, oceans. My hometown was really peaceful. But did you have to fight to survive every day? Kes asked. Jake laughed. No, nothing like that. I went to school, played sports, hung out with friends. Normal stuff. Sports? Zeph asked. What kind of sports? Well, I played football and did some martial arts. The 3 aliens stopped walking. They stared at Jake with expressions he could not quite read. Martial arts? Lyra said slowly. You mean fighting arts? Well, yeah. But it's not really fighting. It's more like exercise and learning discipline. My parents thought it would be good for me. Kes made a small squeaking sound. Your parents wanted you to learn how to fight? Not fight exactly. More like self-defense, I guess. Just basic stuff in case I ever needed it. The aliens exchanged glances that Jake did not understand. He was starting to realize that what seemed normal to him might be very strange to them. Don't worry, he said quickly. I'm not violent or anything. I've never actually had to use any of that stuff. It's just good to know, you know? But as they continued walking to their rooms, Jake could not shake the feeling that his new friends were seeing him very differently than he saw himself. And tomorrow, he would have his first conflict resolution and personal safety class. 3 weeks had passed since Jake arrived at Kepler-7 Academy. He was starting to feel more comfortable around his alien classmates, though he still noticed the way some of them watched him carefully. It was like they expected him to do something dangerous at any moment. His classes were going well. Galactic history was fascinating, and he enjoyed learning about the different worlds and cultures. Interspecies communication helped him understand why some of his jokes didn't translate well to other species, but today was different. Today was his first practical lesson in conflict resolution and personal safety. Jake walked into the classroom with Zeph, Kes, and Lyra. The room was large and open, with soft mats covering the floor. Professor Valen stood at the front, looking as graceful as always in her flowing white robes. Good morning, students, she said with a warm smile. Today we begin the practical portion of our safety course. For the past 3 weeks, we have discussed the theory of peaceful conflict resolution. Now we will learn some basic physical techniques for personal safety. Jake looked around the room. There were about 20 students from different species. Most looked nervous or excited. A few of the smaller aliens, like Kess, seemed worried. Remember, Professor Valen continued, the goal is never to harm anyone. These techniques are designed to help you escape from dangerous situations and seek help. Violence is never the answer. She gestured to a tall, blue-skinned student named Ren. Let us start with a simple demonstration. Ren, please grab my wrist gently. Ren stepped forward and carefully placed his hand around Professor Valen's wrist. She showed the class how to slowly twist her hand and step away, creating distance between herself and the imaginary attacker. See how I do not struggle or fight, she explained. I simply create space and move away. The goal is to escape, not to confront. The students nodded and began practicing in pairs. Jake watched as his classmates went through the motions. Their movements were slow and careful. Even when they were pretending to be attackers, they barely touched each other. Lyra practiced with a small furry creature named Pip. When Pip grabbed Lyra's wing, she gently pulled away and took 2 steps back. Both of them smiled and seemed proud of their technique. Very good, everyone, Professor Valen said after a few minutes. Now let us try another scenario. What if someone grabs you from behind? She demonstrated with Ren again. When he put his arms around her shoulders from behind, she showed how to duck down slightly and slip out to the side. Again, everything was gentle and slow. Jake paired up with Kess for this exercise. The small amphibian was even more careful than the others, barely touching Jake at all. When Jake practiced escaping, he moved as slowly as he could, not wanting to scare his friend. After 30 minutes of practice, Professor Valen called the class together. Excellent work, everyone. Now let us have a few students demonstrate what they have learned. Several students volunteered. Each demonstration was the same. Gentle movements, careful escapes, and lots of emphasis on running away and calling for help. The alien students watched each other with approval and clapped politely after each demonstration. Anyone else? Professor Valen asked, looking around the room. Jake raised his hand without thinking. I can show something. He immediately noticed the change in the room. Conversation stopped. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Professor Valen's smile flickered for just a moment. Of course, Jake, she said. Please come forward. And remember, we are focusing on gentle escape techniques. Jake walked to the center of the mat. Should I demonstrate the same stuff everyone else did, or can I show some other basic techniques? Basic techniques would be fine, Professor Valen said carefully. Zeph, would you please assist Jake? Zeph's crystal form dimmed slightly, but he moved forward. What would you like me to do? Just grab my wrist like Ren did with Professor Valen, Jake said with a friendly smile. Zeph placed one of his crystal appendages around Jake's wrist, barely making contact. Okay, so this is just basic stuff, Jake said to the class. If someone grabs your wrist, you don't want to pull against their strength. Jake demonstrated the same gentle twist that Professor Valen had shown, but something was different. Even though Jake was trying to move slowly, his motion was crisp and confident. His body moved with a fluidity that none of the aliens had shown. But if they're holding tight, Jake continued, you can do this. He rotated his wrist in a quick, smooth motion that broke Zeph's grip instantly. The crystal being took a step back, surprised by how easily Jake had escaped. That was very good, Professor, Valen said quickly. Thank you for the demonstration. Oh, I'm not done yet, Jake said cheerfully. I figured I'd show a few more basic things. Kess, want to help? Kess looked nervous but stepped forward. Jake positioned him carefully. Okay, so if someone grabs you from behind like this, Jake had Kess put his arms around his waist from behind. Then, instead of the gentle duck and slip that Professor Valen had shown, Jake demonstrated a simple hip throw. He moved slowly and carefully, but even at half speed, the technique was clearly effective. Kess ended up gently placed on the mat, completely bewildered by how he had gotten there. The classroom was dead silent. How did you do that? Kess asked from the floor, his large eyes wide with amazement. It's just basic physics, Jake explained, helping his friend up. You use their weight against them. My mom taught me this when I was like 12. Several students gasped. Lyra's feathers fluffed up in alarm. Your mother taught you this? Yeah, all human kids learn basic self-defense, Jake said, not noticing the growing tension in the room. It's no big deal. Want me to show you guys some other stuff? Professor Valen stepped forward, her voice carefully controlled. Jake, perhaps we should… Oh, this is a good one, Jake interrupted, turning to face the class. So if someone tries to grab you by the shoulders… He asked Ren to help demonstrate. When the tall blue alien placed his hands on Jake's shoulders, Jake showed how to break the grip and create distance. But again, even his gentle demonstration looked like advanced combat techniques to the aliens. And if they try to push you, Jake continued, you can redirect their force like this. He guided Ren through a simple deflection that ended with the blue alien off balance and confused. Jake caught him before he could fall, grinning at the class. This is all just kid stuff, really. Wait until I show you what to do if someone has a weapon. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Professor Valen's glowing skin had gone pale. Zeph's crystal form was flickering rapidly. Kess had backed away until he was pressed against the wall. Jake, Professor Valen said very quietly, I think that will be enough for today. Jake looked around at his classmates. Their faces showed expressions he had never seen before: fear, horror. Some looked like they might run from the room at any moment. Did I do something wrong? He asked, genuinely confused. I was just showing basic self-defense. I didn't even demonstrate anything serious. Those words made things worse. Lyra made a small chirping sound of distress. Pip had actually hidden behind another student. Class dismissed, Professor Valen announced, her voice shaking slightly. We will continue our lessons next week. The students began filing out quickly, many of them glancing back at Jake with wide eyes. He stood in the center of the mat, completely bewildered by their reactions. Zeph, he called to his roommate, wait up. But Zeph was already at the door, moving faster than Jake had ever seen him move. Within moments, Jake was alone in the classroom with Professor Valen. Professor, he said, I really don't understand what happened. Did I break some rule? Professor Valen looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was very quiet. Jake, what you just demonstrated, to us, those are not basic techniques, those are advanced combat skills. But they're really not, Jake protested. I was holding back so much. I didn't want to hurt anyone. Professor Valen closed her eyes. You were holding back? Of course, I mean I didn't show them knife defense or gun disarms or anything actually dangerous. The professor sat down heavily on a nearby chair. Jake realized he had somehow made everything much worse, but he still didn't understand how. Jake walked back to his room feeling confused and upset. The hallways seemed quieter than usual, and he noticed that other students moved out of his way when they saw him coming. Some even crossed to the other side of the corridor. When he reached his room, he found it empty. Zeph's belongings were still there, but his roommate was nowhere to be seen. Jake sat on his bed and tried to understand what had gone wrong in class. The next morning, Jake woke up to find Zeph packing his crystals into a storage container. Are you going somewhere? Jake asked, rubbing his eyes. Zeph's light patterns flickered nervously. I have requested a room change. Administrator Quinn approved it this morning. Why? Did I do something to upset you? Zeph paused in his packing. Jake, you seem like a nice person, but after yesterday's class, I think it would be better if I lived with someone else. But I don't understand what I did wrong, Jake said, sitting up in bed. I was just showing some basic moves. Basic? Zeph's voice pitched higher. Jake, you threw Kess across the room like he weighed nothing. I was super gentle with him. I made sure he landed softly. You made it look easy. Too easy. Zeph finished packing and moved toward the door. I am sorry, Jake. I know you do not mean to be frightening, but I cannot help how I feel. After Zeph left, Jake got dressed and went to the dining hall for breakfast. Usually he sat with Kess, Lyra, and some other friends. But today their table was empty when he arrived. He got his food and sat alone, watching other students whisper and point in his direction. Lyra finally approached his table. but she stayed standing and kept her distance. "Jake," she said quietly, "we need to talk." "Please sit down," Jake said, grateful that someone was finally talking to him. "I really need to understand what happened yesterday." Lyra remained standing. "That is what I want to talk about. What you showed us in class, those were not safety techniques." "But they were," Jake insisted. "They were the gentlest moves I know. I learned them when I was a kid." "You learned combat techniques as a child?" "They're not combat techniques. They're just basic self-defense. Every human learns this stuff." Lyra's feathers ruffled. "Every human?" "Well, yeah. My little sister Lucy knows all this and more. She's only 14. Lyra took a step back. "Your 14-year-old sister could do what you did yesterday?" "Easy. She's actually better at it than I am. She takes classes 3 times a week." "Classes? There are schools that teach this?" Jake nodded. "Martial arts schools are everywhere on Earth. Lucy does karate and jiu-jitsu. I did taekwondo and some boxing when I was younger." Lyra made a soft whistling sound that Jake had learned meant she was distressed. "Boxing? You learn to hit people? It's not about hitting people," Jake tried to explain. "It's about discipline, exercise, self-control. The whole point is learning when not to fight." "But you know how to fight." "Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean I want to. I've never actually been in a real fight in my life." Lyra stared at him for a long moment. "Jake, I need to ask you something, and please be honest. If you wanted to, could you hurt someone in this dining hall?" Jake looked around at the various alien students eating their breakfast. He saw small, delicate creatures like Kess, fragile bird people like Lyra, and even the larger aliens who seemed built more for thinking than physical activity. "I don't want to hurt anyone," he said carefully. "That is not what I asked." "Could you?" Jake felt uncomfortable. "I mean, I guess, but I would never." "How many?" "What? If you had to defend yourself against multiple attackers, how many could you handle?" Jake shifted in his seat. This conversation was making him very uncomfortable. "Lyra, why are you asking me this? Oh, please, just answer." Jake thought about it. "I don't know. It would depend on who they were and what they were trying to do. But I really don't want to think about stuff like that." Lyra's eyes went wide. "You do not even know your own limits." "It's not about limits. I would never hurt my friends." "But you could. Anyone could hurt anyone if they really wanted to," Jake said, getting frustrated. "That doesn't mean they will." Lyra shook her head. "Jake, most of us could not hurt someone even if we wanted to. Kess weighs 30 pounds and has no muscles to speak of. I have hollow bones that break if I fall wrong. Zeph is made of crystal. That could shatter with a hard impact." Jake started to understand. "You're all fragile. Compared to you?" "Yes, very fragile." That afternoon, Jake had his second conflict resolution class. He entered the room to find only half the usual number of students present. Professor Valen stood at the front looking tired. "Today we will continue our safety demonstrations," she announced. "Jake, since you seem to have additional knowledge in this area, perhaps you could show us some more techniques." Jake noticed the way she said it. There was something different in her voice. "Are you sure? Everyone seemed upset yesterday." "I think it would be educational for the class to see what you consider basic knowledge." Jake looked around the room. The students who had stayed were watching him with a mixture of fear and fascination. "Okay, but I'll be really careful." "Show us what you would do if someone grabbed you by the shirt," Professor Valen said. Jake asked Ren to help again. When the blue alien grabbed the front of Jake's shirt, Jake demonstrated a simple hand placement and twist that broke the grip and put Ren off balance. "This is just basic stuff," Jake explained to the class. "You grab their hand, step to the side and twist. It works because of leverage. But even this simple movement looked impossibly fast and smooth to the aliens watching." "What if someone pushes you?" Professor Valen asked. Jake showed them how to redirect a push using the attacker's momentum to send them past you. When he demonstrated with Ren, the blue alien stumbled and nearly fell. "Sorry," Jake said, catching Ren's arm. "I'm trying to go slow." That was slow, Kes squeaked from the corner where he was hiding behind a larger student. Super slow, Jake confirmed. In a real situation, you'd have to move much faster. Several students made worried noises. Show us faster, Professor Valen said quietly. I don't think that's a good idea. Please, Jake. We need to understand. Jake looked around the room. The students were scared but seemed to want to see what he could really do. Okay, but just a little faster. Ren, push me like you're really trying. Ren pushed harder this time. Jake's response was still controlled but faster than before. The redirect sent Ren spinning across the mat to land safely but dizzy on the other side. The room erupted in shocked gasps and whispers. And that's still really slow, Jake added helpfully. My sister could do that twice as fast. Professor Valen sat down heavily. What else can you do? Jake thought for a moment. Well, there are strikes to pressure points, joint locks, takedowns, throws. Show us a pressure point technique. Jake demonstrated on himself, pressing a spot on his own arm that made his fingers go numb temporarily. This can stop someone without really hurting them. The aliens looked horrified. What about weapons? Professor Valen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Weapons? Jake looked confused. I don't have any weapons. No, I mean defense against weapons. Oh, Jake brightened. Sure, there are techniques for knives, sticks, guns, pretty much anything someone might attack you with. Guns, Lyra whispered. Projectile weapons are common on Earth, Jake explained. But the techniques for dealing with them are pretty advanced. I wouldn't try to show those without proper safety equipment. The classroom was completely silent, except for the sound of Kes hyperventilating in the corner. Jake, Professor Valen said very carefully, when you say these are basic techniques, what do you mean? I mean, this is stuff every human kid learns. Like I said, my mom taught me most of this when I was 12. It's just common sense safety stuff. And what would you consider advanced techniques? Jake scratched his head. I don't know. Military, combat training, special forces stuff, weapons training, lethal techniques. He paused. But I don't know any of that. I'm just a regular guy. Professor Valen closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Class dismissed. Jake, please stay after. As the students filed out, Jake heard fragments of whispered conversations. Did you see how fast he moved? He said his sister is better than him. A whole planet of people like that. No wonder they call it a death world. When they were alone, Professor Valen looked at Jake with an expression he could not read. Jake, I need you to understand something. What you have shown us today, to our people, these are not basic safety techniques. These are advanced combat skills that could seriously injure or kill most species in this room. But I was being so careful, Jake protested. I know you were, and that might be the most frightening part of all. The Academy's administration building was quieter than usual, as Dean Mora sat in her office reviewing the security footage from Jake's demonstrations. Her silver hair reflected the light from the screen as she watched the human student move with fluid precision through what he called basic techniques. Administrator Quinn sat across from her, all four arms folded nervously. Dean Mora, the students are requesting transfers to other programs. Some parents are demanding their children be sent home immediately. Dean Mora paused the video at the moment when Jake effortlessly redirected Ren's push, sending the much larger alien spinning across the room. Have we verified that this student has no formal military training? According to his records, Jake Morrison is a civilian from a place called Ohio. No military background, no police training. He was accepted based on his academic performance in something called engineering. And he learned these techniques as a child? That is what he claims. He says his mother taught him basic self-defense when he was 12 years old. Dean Mora replayed the footage again. Even in slow motion, Jake's movements were impossibly smooth and controlled. Basic self-defense, she repeated quietly. There is more, Administrator Quinn said hesitantly. Professor Valen submitted a report. After yesterday's class, according to the student, he has a younger sister who is supposedly more skilled than he is. More skilled? 14 years old. The human claims she could perform these techniques faster and more effectively. Dean Mora stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the peaceful corridors of the academy. Students from dozens of species moved slowly and carefully, the way civilized beings should move. None of them looked like they could harm a dust mite, let alone demonstrate combat techniques that could disable multiple opponents. What else did Professor Valen learn? The human mentioned weapons training. Apparently, Earth teaches defense against projectile weapons, bladed weapons, and impact weapons as standard curriculum. Standard curriculum? For children. Dean Mora turned back to face Administrator Quinn. Contact the Earth Embassy. I need to speak with someone about human education immediately. Meanwhile, Jake sat alone in his new single room, trying to understand why his life at the academy had fallen apart. No one would eat with him anymore. Students crossed hallways to avoid him. Even the maintenance robots seemed to give him extra space when they passed by. He had tried to apologize to Zeph, but his former roommate would not even look at him. Kess had actually run away when Jake approached him in the library. Only Lyra still talked to him, but even she kept her distance and seemed nervous around him. Jake's personal communicator chimed with a message from Dean Mora requesting his presence in her office. He made his way through the empty corridors, wondering if he was about to be expelled. The dean's office was large and formal with windows showing the stars outside. Dean Mora sat behind a massive desk that seemed to be carved from a single piece of dark wood. Her expression was unreadable. "Please sit down, Jake," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. Jake sat carefully, trying not to make any sudden movements. He had learned that sudden movements made the aliens nervous. "I have been reviewing footage of your demonstrations," Dean Mora began. "I need to ask you some questions about your background." "Okay. You claim to have no military training." "That's right, I've never been in the military." "No police training?" "No. No formal combat instruction of any kind." Jake thought about this. "Well, I took martial arts classes when I was younger, but that's not really combat training. It's more like sports, I guess." Dean Mora made a note on her pad. "These martial arts classes, how long did you attend them?" "About 6 years, from age 8 to 14. 6 years of weapons training." "No, no weapons, just hand-to-hand stuff. Learning forms, sparring with other kids, basic self-defense." "Sparring?" "Practice fighting, with pads and rules and referees. No one gets hurt." Dean Mora stared at him. "You practiced fighting with other children for 6 years. It wasn't real fighting, it was controlled practice, like a sport. And your sister still participates in these activities?" "Yeah, Lucy loves it, she's really good. She won some tournaments last year." "Tournaments?" "Competitions. Kids from different schools compete to see who's best." Dean Mora set down her pad and rubbed her temples. "Jake, let me make sure I understand this correctly. On Earth, children regularly engage in formalized combat competitions." "Well, when you say it like that, it sounds bad. But it's really not. It's about discipline, respect, physical fitness. Most of the time you're just practicing forms and techniques." "And these forms and techniques, they are designed to disable opponents?" Jake shifted uncomfortably. "I mean, in a real self-defense situation, yeah, you might need to stop someone who's trying to hurt you. But the whole philosophy is about avoiding conflict. By being more dangerous than your opponent. By being prepared to defend yourself if you have no other choice." Dean Mora stood up and walked to her window again. "Jake, I want you to understand something about the galactic community. Most species evolved on worlds where cooperation was necessary for survival. Predators were rare or non-existent. Violence is not just uncommon in our societies, it is almost unthinkable. I'm starting to understand that. When Professor Valen asks students to demonstrate escape techniques, she expects them to gently step away and call for help. When you demonstrated escape techniques, you showed movements that could break bones, dislocate joints, or render someone unconscious. But I was being gentle. I know you were. That is what makes this so concerning." Dean Mora turned back to face him. The fact that you could perform such devastating techniques while barely trying suggests capabilities that frankly terrify my staff. Jake felt his heart sink. Are you going to send me home? I am trying to decide what to do. My first instinct is to remove you from the academy for everyone's safety. But I would never hurt anyone here. These are my friends. Your friends are afraid of you, Jake. They look at you and see a predator among prey animals. That's not fair. I'm not a predator. Are you not? Dean Mora sat back down. Jake, let me ask you something. If every student in your conflict resolution class attacked you at once, what would happen? Jake looked uncomfortable. I don't want to think about that. Please. Humor me. Jake was quiet for a long moment. They would get hurt, he said finally. Not because I want to hurt them, but because they don't know how to fight safely. They could injure themselves just trying to grab me. And you would be unharmed? Probably. 20 students and you would be unharmed. Look, I know how that sounds, but you have to understand. What I understand, Dean Mora interrupted, is that we have admitted a student who could single-handedly defeat our entire security force without breaking a sweat. Your security force? 3 elderly administrators and a maintenance robot. Jake stared at her. That's it? What if there's a real emergency? What kind of emergency? The most dangerous thing that has happened at this academy in 300 years was a student accidentally knocking over a plant. But what if someone dangerous came here? Pirates or criminals or... Jake, there are no pirates in this sector. There are no criminals. There is no violence anywhere in the civilized galaxy except for stories about deathworlds like yours. Jake began to understand the scope of the misunderstanding. You all live in a completely peaceful universe. Yes. And then you arrived. They sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Dean Mora spoke again. I received a communication from the Earth Embassy this morning. They confirmed everything you have told me. Human children do indeed learn combat techniques as standard education. Your abilities are considered normal for your species. So what happens now? I honestly do not know. Part of me thinks you should be sent home immediately. But another part of me wonders if perhaps we need to learn from you. Learn what? How to survive in a universe that is not as peaceful as we thought. Before Jake could respond, an alarm began sounding throughout the academy. Red lights flashed in the corridor outside. Over the intercom, a panicked voice announced, "Emergency in lower section 7. Structural collapse. Students trapped. All. Available personnel respond immediately." Dean Mora's face went pale. "We have no personnel trained for emergency rescue." Jake stood up. "I do." "What?" "I'm trained in emergency first aid and rescue. It was part of my martial arts training. We learned how to help people who get hurt." Dean Mora looked at him with new understanding. "Your combat training included medical knowledge?" "Of course. If you know how to hurt someone, you need to know how to help them too." The alarm continued to sound. Dean Mora made a decision. "Go," she said. Jake ran through the corridors faster than he had moved since arriving at the academy. Students pressed against the walls as he passed, but for the first time, he did not care about scaring them. People were in danger, and that was all that mattered. Lower, Section 7 was in chaos when he arrived. A ceiling panel had collapsed, blocking the main corridor with heavy metal beams and debris. Emergency lights flashed red, and Jake could hear voices crying for help from the other side of the blockage. Professor Valen stood near the debris with several other faculty members, looking helpless. "The rescue team from the nearest station will not arrive for 2 hours," she told Dean Mora, who had arrived just behind Jake. "We cannot move these beams. They are too heavy." Jake pushed past them and examined the collapse. 3 large metal beams had fallen at angles, creating a small space underneath, but blocking the corridor completely. He could hear at least 4 voices on the other side, including one that sounded like Lyra crying for help. "Stand back," Jake said, rolling up his sleeves. "Jake, those beams weigh several hundred pounds each," Dean Mora protested. "Even you cannot." Jake was already moving. He found the best grip on the first beam and lifted with his legs, not his back, just like his father had taught him when they worked together in the garage. The beam rose slowly but steadily. Professor Valen gasped as Jake moved it aside like it was made of cardboard. "Someone hold this debris back," Jake called as he grabbed the second beam. "I need to make sure nothing else falls." Administrator Quinn used two of his forearms to brace some loose panels while Jake moved the second beam. The pathway was almost clear, but the third beam was the largest and was wedged at a dangerous angle. "This one is tricky," Jake muttered, studying the problem. "If I move it wrong, more stuff might come down." He positioned himself carefully and began to lift. The beam was heavier than the others, and Jake had to strain to move it. His muscles stood out on his arms as he slowly raised the massive piece of metal and guided it safely to the side. The pathway was clear. "Lyra?" Jake called into the dark space beyond. "Are you okay?" "Jake?" came Lyra's weak voice. "Is that really you?" "Yeah, it's me. I'm coming to get you." Jake crawled through the narrow opening he had created. On the other side, he found Lyra lying against the wall with her wing bent at an odd angle. Kes sat next to her, holding her hand with his webbed fingers. Two other students, Pip and a tall plant-like creature named Sage, were huddled in the corner. "My wing is broken," Lyra said quietly. "I cannot move it at all." Jake knelt beside her and gently examined the injury. His martial arts training had included basic first aid, and he knew how to check for serious damage without causing more pain. "It's definitely broken, but it's a clean break," he told her. "We need to keep it still while we get you out of here." "How?" Kes asked. "The space you made is too small for her to fit through with her wings." Jake looked back at the opening. Kes was right. Even with her good wing folded, Lyra would not be able to crawl through the narrow gap. "I'll have to make it bigger." "But if you move more beams, the whole ceiling might come down," Sage said in his whispering tree voice. Jake studied the structure above them. Some of the ceiling panels were cracked and sagging, but the main support beams were still solid. "Could make the opening larger, but it would require very precise movements." "Trust me," he said simply. Jake crawled back through to the other side and began working. He moved debris piece by piece, always checking the stability of what remained. When he found a beam that was supporting weight, he carefully redistributed the load before moving it. Dean Mora and the other faculty watched in amazement as Jake seemed to understand the engineering of the collapse instinctively. "How does he know how to do this?" Professor Valen whispered. "Humans live on a world that tries to kill them every day," Dean Mora replied quietly. "They learn to solve problems that would never occur to us." After 20 minutes of careful work, Jake had created an opening large enough for Lyra to pass through safely. He crawled back to get her and found that Kes had used his shirt to make a simple sling for her broken wing. "Good thinking," Jake told the small amphibian. "That will help keep it stable." Jake carefully lifted Lyra and carried her through the opening. She was much lighter than a human would be, thanks to her hollow bones, but he was extra gentle because of her fragility. Once they were through, he went back for the others. Kes came next, then Pip, and finally Sage, who had to fold his branch-like arms to fit through the space. As soon as they were all safe, Jake knelt beside Lyra again. "I need to set your wing properly before we move you to the medical center," he told her. "You know how to do that too?" she asked weakly. "Basic field medicine. Part of my training." "Your combat training included healing?" Jake paused in his examination of her wing. "Of course it did. The whole point of learning how to fight is learning how to protect people. That includes knowing how to help them when they get hurt." Lyra stared at him with new understanding. "You were never learning how to hurt people. You were learning how to save them. That's what I've been trying to tell everyone." Jake carefully straightened Lyra's wing and used some cloth from his shirt to create a proper splint. His movements were gentle and precise, the same fluid control he had shown in his combat demonstrations, but now used for healing instead of fighting. "All done," he said. "The medical center can do a proper job, but this will keep everything stable until then." Dean Mora had been watching the entire rescue. As Jake lifted Lyra again to carry her to the medical center, she finally understood what she had been seeing in those combat demonstrations. "Jake," she called. "Wait." He turned back, still holding Lyra carefully in his arms. "Your demonstrations in class," Dean Mora said. "You were not showing us how to hurt people. You were showing us how to protect them." "Every technique has two sides," Jake explained. "The same knowledge that lets you stop someone who wants to hurt you also lets you help someone who is already hurt. You can't have one without the other." Professor Valen stepped forward. "The way you move those beams, solved the structural problem, treated Lyra's injury, this is all connected to your combat training?" "Everything is connected. Physical fitness, problem solving, staying calm under pressure, understanding how bodies work, how structures work, how physics works. You can't be a good fighter without understanding all of that." Kess looked up at Jake with his large eyes. "So when you said your sister could do what you do, she could have handled this. Rescue just as well as I did, maybe better. She's really good at the medical stuff. A 14-year-old could have saved us?" "Easy." The group stood in silence for a moment, processing this information. Finally, Lyra spoke from Jake's arms. "I think we owe you an apology, Jake. We thought you were dangerous, but you're the opposite. You're the safest person on this station." "How so?" "Because you know how to handle danger, you know how to protect people." As they walked toward the medical center, word of the rescue spread through the academy. Students lined the corridors, watching as Jake carried Lyra to safety. For the first time since his demonstration, they were not looking at him with fear. They were looking at him with respect. Dean Mora walked beside them, thinking about what she had learned. "Jake, I believe I owe you an apology as well. We judged your abilities without understanding their purpose." "You just didn't know," Jake said simply. "Your people never needed to learn this stuff. You're lucky." "Are we? What if another emergency happens and you are not here to help?" Jake smiled. "Then I guess I better start teaching some classes, real ones this time, where I explain why we learn this stuff, not just how to do it. You would be willing to teach us?" "Of course. Everyone should know how to help people." 3 months later, Jake stood in front of a packed auditorium. His basic, safety and emergency response class had become the most popular course at the academy. Students from dozens of species attended, eager to learn not just the techniques but the philosophy behind them. Zeph had moved back in as his roommate and was now one of his best students. Kess had learned to overcome his fear and was surprisingly good at first aid. Even Lyra, her wing fully healed, had joined the class. "Remember," Jake told his students as they practiced gentle escape techniques, "the goal is never to hurt someone. The goal is to protect, to help, to make sure everyone goes home safe." The students nodded and continued practicing, moving with more confidence than they had ever shown before. They were learning that true strength came not from the ability to cause harm but from the wisdom to prevent it, and Jake finally felt at home among the stars.